She came to Wyoming to clean a house. What she found was a man drowning in grief, 5 children nobody wanted, and a lie that would either destroy her or save them all. Stay until the end, hit like, and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The stagecoach hit a rut hard enough to throw Martha Rowan's shoulder into the wooden frame of the window, and she bit down on the inside of her cheek to keep from cursing out loud. 3 days. 3 days of dust, bad coffee at relay stations, and a driver who talked to his horses more than he talked to her. Her back ached in places she didn't know a body could ache, and the letter in her coat pocket, the one she'd read so many times the creases were starting to tear, felt heavier than it should for a single sheet of paper. She pulled it out anyway. She always did this last stretch of road, like checking a wound to see if it had healed. Wanted. A capable woman for housekeeping duties. Remote ranch, fair wages, room and board provided. Must be hardworking and unafraid of solitude. Apply in person, Granger Ranch, outside Larkspur, Wyoming. Hardworking and unafraid of solitude. Martha had laughed the first time she read those words back in Ohio, sitting in her sister's kitchen with a cup of cooling tea and a stack of newspaper pages spread across the table like a hand of cards she'd been dealt and didn't much like. She was 29 years old. She had spent most of those years being told, in one way or another, that she was the kind of woman men hired and didn't marry. Too plain, too tall, too opinionated for a face that wasn't going to charm anybody into overlooking it. "You're going all the way to Wyoming for a cleaning job?" her sister Ruth had asked. Not unkindly, just tired, the way she always sounded with 4 kids underfoot and a husband who worked the mill 6 days a week. "I'm going to Wyoming because nobody there knows what they're supposed to think of me yet," Martha had said. And that had been the truest thing she'd said in years. Now watching the dry grassland roll by outside the coach window, gold and brown and endless under a sky too big for comfort, she wondered if she'd made a mistake. Not because of the land. The land was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache a little, wide open and honest, nothing hiding behind it. But because something about that advertisement had nagged at her the whole way out here, like a splinter she couldn't quite locate. Unafraid of solitude. Most ranch ads she'd seen back home talked about wages, about the work itself, about whether a woman would have her own room or have to share. This one talked about solitude like it was a warning. She should have paid more attention to warnings. She'd learn that soon enough. The driver let her off at a crossroads that barely deserved the name, just a leaning signpost and a water trough half full of green scum, and told her someone from the Granger place would be along to fetch her. She waited an hour in the heat with her single travel bag at her feet, and her bonnet doing nothing against the sun, watching dust devils spin themselves apart in the distance, before she heard the wagon. It wasn't Silas Granger driving it. It was a boy, maybe 12 or 13, thin in the way boys get when nobody's been cooking for them properly, with a face that had decided early on not to trust strangers and hadn't found a reason to change its mind since. "You the housekeeper?" he asked, not bothering to climb down and help her with the bag. "I suppose I am," Martha said, hauling it up onto the wagon bed herself. "And you'd be?" "Jacob." He said it like a fact he was tired of repeating. "Pa's at the house. Couldn't come himself. Things are bad right now." "Things are bad," Martha repeated, settling herself on the bench beside him. "That's an interesting way to put it." Jacob didn't answer. He snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, and Martha spent the next 40 minutes studying the side of a boy's face that looked far older than it should, trying to read what things are bad might mean and getting nowhere. She got her answer when the ranch house came into view. It wasn't ruined exactly. The bones of it were good. A solid 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch that someone had clearly built with care once, a long time ago. But the paint was peeling in long gray strips. One of the porch steps had collapsed and nobody had fixed it, just laid a plank across the gap like that was a solution instead of a hazard. The barn beyond it leaned slightly, the way buildings lean when nobody's had the time or the will to shore them up. And the yard was the worst of it. Chickens running loose with no coop in sight to call home, a clothesline sagging under shirts that had clearly been rained on and left to dry wrong, twice, and a child's wooden toy horse lying face down in the mud like nobody had noticed it was missing. Martha had grown up poor. She knew what poverty looked like. This wasn't poverty. This was a house where somebody had simply stopped. "Jacob." She kept her voice even. How many of you live here? Me, Pa, my sisters. Mary's 16, Caroline's 11. The twins are 7. He paused, and something in his jaw tightened. And the baby, Ellie, she's 2. 5 children, Martha said slowly. And your father runs this whole ranch alone? He used to have help. Jacob's hands tightened on the reins. We had hired men before. Pa let him go when he couldn't pay regular no more. After... He stopped himself, hard, like a door slamming. After what? You'll see, Jacob said, and that was all he gave her. Silas Granger came out onto the porch as the wagon rolled into the yard, and Martha's first thought, God help her, was that grief had a way of making a man's face into a map of every bad thing that had ever happened to him. He was tall, taller than she'd expected, with the kind of build that came from years of work, not gym exercise, broad through the shoulders but gaunt in the face, like the muscle had been there once and the flesh had simply forgotten to keep up. His beard was unkempt, more out of neglect than style. His eyes were a pale gray blue, and they looked at her the way a man looks at a bill he can't pay. Mrs. Rowan, he said, I'm Silas Granger. Miss Rowan, Martha corrected, climbing down from the wagon without waiting for help, which was good because none was offered. Mr. Granger, I have to say your advertisement was a bit thin on details. I know it was. He didn't apologize exactly. He just said it like a fact, the same flat way Jacob had said things were bad. Come inside, we can talk. The inside of the house told the same story as the outside, only louder. Dishes stacked in a basin that hadn't seen water in days. A floor that needed sweeping so badly Martha could feel grit under her boots with every step. A baby's cry from somewhere upstairs, thin and exhausted. The kind of crying that had been going on long enough that the child had nearly given up expecting anyone to come. That's Ellie, Silas said, not moving toward the stairs. Mary's got her. Shouldn't you? Mary's got her, he said again, more firmly, and something about the way he said it made Martha go quiet. There was a wall there. She could feel it even before she understood what was behind it. He led her to the kitchen table, gestured for her to sit, and lowered himself into the chair across from her like a man twice his age. For a long moment, he just looked at his hands. I need to tell you something, he said finally, before you decide whether you're staying. I'm listening. The advertisement said, Housekeeper. He met her eyes then, and there was something almost like shame in them. That's true. I do need someone to keep this house. God knows it needs keeping. But it's not just dishes and laundry, Miss Rowan. It's 5 children who lost their mother 8 months ago, and a man who hasn't figured out how to be a father to all of them at once, and a ranch that's 3 bad seasons from going under. I needed to write something that would get someone out here. I wasn't sure the truth would do it. Martha sat very still. You lied to me. I left things out, Silas said. I won't pretend that's different. I know it isn't. 8 months, Martha said slowly, doing the math, looking around at the state of the house. The unwashed dishes, the missing porch step, the child crying upstairs that nobody had gone to comfort. 8 months and the house looks like this? It got worse before it got this bad, he said, and there was an edge in his voice now, something raw. You think I don't know what this house looks like? You think I haven't tried? I bury my wife. I've got a 2-year-old who doesn't sleep through the night, twin boys who got expelled from school twice for fighting, an 11-year-old who won't speak above a whisper since her mother died, a 16-year-old who's had to be a mother to 4 siblings when she's still a child herself, and a ranch that needs 4 hands and has one. I don't sleep, Miss Rowan. I haven't slept right in 8 months, so forgive me if the house isn't swept. The silence after that was thick enough to choke on. Martha looked at this man, furious, exhausted, ashamed of his own fury, and felt something complicated move through her chest. Anger, yes. He had deceived her, brought her 3 days across the country under false pretenses. But underneath the anger was something else, something that recognized the particular exhaustion of a person who had been carrying too much for too long and had run out of ways to ask for help that didn't sound like begging. I should leave, she said, mostly to herself. You should, Silas agreed, which surprised her. I won't stop you. There's a coach back through the crossroads tomorrow morning. I'll pay your fare and a week's wage for your trouble, and I'm sorry I wasted your time. He said it like a man who expected to lose and had already made peace with it, Martha stood up from the table. She walked to the window and looked out at the sagging clothesline, the loose chickens, the missing fence rail by the barn. She thought about the 3-day journey behind her, about Ruth's kitchen and the newspaper pages spread out like a bad hand of cards, about 29 years of being looked at and looked past. She thought, I came out here because nobody knew what to think of me yet, and here's a man who clearly doesn't have the time to think anything of me at all. That, at least, is honest. She was halfway to deciding, leave in the morning, take the money, go back to Ohio with a story to tell Ruth over tea, when she heard footsteps on the stairs, small and uneven, and turned to see a little girl standing in the kitchen doorway. She was maybe 4 years old, with dark hair escaping its braid, and a face streaked with the particular blotchiness of a child who'd been crying recently and trying to hide it. She had a rag doll clutched against her chest, missing one button eye, loved nearly to pieces. Caroline said you're leaving, the girl said. Martha crouched down without thinking about it, the way she'd done 1,000 times with Ruth's children. I haven't decided yet, sweetheart. What's your name? Sarah. The girl's chin trembled. I'm 7. Caroline's my sister. She said the lady who came is going to look at this house and leave just like the last one did. The last one? Silas had gone very still in his chair. There was a lady before, Sarah said, twisting the doll's worn fabric between small fingers. Mrs. Pruitt. She came to help, and she stayed 2 days, and then she said it was too much, and she left and didn't say goodbye to nobody. Caroline cried for a week. Martha looked past the girl, through the doorway, where she could now see a thin shape pressed against the wall in the hallway, older, maybe 11, with her arms wrapped around herself and her eyes fixed on the floor. Caroline, the one who didn't speak above a whisper anymore. She wasn't speaking now at all. And there, at the bottom of the stairs, holding a fussing toddler against her hip with the weary competence of someone twice her actual age, stood a 16-year-old girl who could only be Mary, watching this whole exchange with an expression that had given up hoping for good news a long time ago. Martha felt something crack open in her chest. Sarah, she said gently, is your sister Caroline scared I'm going to leave too? The girl nodded, miserable. Honey, I haven't even unpacked my bag. That's what Mrs. Pruitt said, Sarah whispered. And that, more than the lie in the advertisement, more than the unswept floors, more than Silas Granger's raw, furious exhaustion, was the thing that undid Martha Rowan completely. Not pity. She'd had enough of pity in her own life to know the difference, to know how it curdled and how little good it did anybody. This wasn't pity. This was recognition. She knew what it was to be left. She knew what it was to brace yourself for it before it even happened, to expect so little from people that their leaving barely surprised you anymore, just confirmed something you already believed about your own worth. She looked at Sarah's tear-streaked face, at Caroline pressed silent against the hallway wall, at Mary holding a crying toddler with the exhausted patience of a girl who'd had to grow up 8 months too fast, and she understood, with a clarity that settled into her bones like cold water, that this was not a decision about a job anymore. Sarah reached out and grabbed Martha's hand. Her small fingers were cold, and they gripped tighter than a 4-year-old's grip had any right to. Please don't leave us, she said. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't a plea designed to manipulate. They were simple, exhausted, and absolutely sincere. The words of a child who had already learned that adults leave and was asking, against everything she'd learned, for this one not to. Martha looked up and met Silas Granger's eyes across the kitchen. He hadn't moved. His jaw was tight, and there was something in his face she hadn't expected to see there. Not pleading, he was too proud a man for that, but something close to it. A man watching the last possibility he hadn't quite admitted to himself slip through his fingers, bracing for it the way you brace for a blow you know is coming. Mr. Granger, Martha said slowly, I want to be very clear about something. All right, I'm not staying for you. Her voice was steady, even as her heart was doing something complicated and unfamiliar in her chest. I'm angry about that advertisement. I think you should have told me the truth, and I think you know that. If I stay, it won't be because I've forgiven you for that, not yet. It'll be because of her. She nodded down at Sarah, whose grip on her hand hadn't loosened. And because of that girl in the hallway who hasn't said a word since I walked in this house. And because that baby upstairs has been crying for longer than any baby should cry without somebody coming. Silas's throat worked. Miss Rowan, I'm not finished. Martha straightened, squaring her shoulders the way she did when she needed her spine to be braver than her stomach felt. If I stay, things change. The dishes get washed today, the porch step gets fixed by the end of the week, and you— She looked at him directly, refusing to soften it. You start being a father to all 5 of these children, not just the one who's old enough to drive a wagon and the one who cries the loudest. Because I will not spend whatever time I'm here patching a house while the people inside it keep falling apart. The kitchen was silent except for the baby's distant, tired crying and the small, hopeful sound of Sarah's breathing. Silas Granger looked at this stranger who had just walked into his ruined house, called out his lie to his face, and was now laying down terms like she had any right to, which, Martha realized with something like surprise, she now did, because she had decided in the space of about 90 seconds that she wasn't getting on that coach tomorrow. "All right," he said finally, quietly. "All right, Miss Rowan." It wasn't gratitude, not exactly. It was something rawer than that. Relief mixed with shame, mixed with a fear so old he'd stopped recognizing it as fear and just called it tired. But it was enough. Martha nodded once, like they'd settled a business arrangement instead of something far more dangerous, and turned back to Sarah. "Well," she said, crouching down again so she was eye level with the girl, "I suppose I'd better go say hello to your sister Caroline, and then I want to meet that baby who's been crying her lungs out. After that, somebody's going to have to show me where the soap is, because this kitchen is a disgrace." Sarah let out a small, surprised laugh. The first one Martha would hear from any of them, though it wouldn't be the last. She walked toward this hallway where Caroline stood pressed against the wall, and she didn't rush her, didn't crouch down and demand a smile the way well-meaning adults sometimes did with frightened children. She simply stopped a respectful distance away and said, "Caroline, I'm Martha. I'm not going anywhere, but I understand if you don't believe me yet. That's all right. You don't have to believe me today." Caroline didn't speak, but her eyes lifted just slightly from the floor to Martha's face and stayed there a moment longer than they had before. It was a beginning. Martha had learned enough in 29 years to know that beginnings rarely announce themselves with fanfare. They were quiet, mostly. A child's eyes lifting from the floor. A small hand gripping yours and not letting go. A house full of broken pieces, and one stubborn woman deciding, against every reasonable instinct she had, to stay and see if they could be put back together. She climbed the stairs toward the sound of the crying baby, past a banister that needed sanding and a hallway carpet worn thin from years of small feet, and she did not look back down at Silas Granger standing alone in his kitchen, watching her go with an expression he would have been embarrassed to let anyone see. Mary met her at the top of the stairs, still holding Ellie, who had quieted slightly at the sound of new footsteps, curiosity briefly winning out over exhaustion. "You're really staying?" Mary asked. Her voice had the flat, careful neutrality of a girl who'd learned not to hope for things out loud. "I'm really staying," Martha said, and held out her arms for the baby. After a long moment, Mary handed her over. Ellie was warm and solid and smelled like she badly needed a bath, and she studied Martha's face with the unblinking seriousness only very small children manage, like she was trying to decide something important. Then, without warning, she reached up and grabbed a fistful of Martha's hair and tugged, hard. "Ow," Martha said, and laughed despite herself, the sound surprising her as much as it surprised Mary, who stared at her like she'd never heard laughter happen in this house before. Maybe she hadn't, not in a long while. Outside, the Wyoming sun was sliding lower, painting the sagging clothesline and the loose chickens and the leaning barn in gold light that made even the ruin of the place look, for a moment, like something that could still be saved. Martha stood at the top of the stairs with a strange baby on her hip, and a house full of broken children below her, and a man downstairs who had lied to bring her here, and somehow, impossibly, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not pity, not obligation, purpose. She didn't know yet what it would cost her. The long nights ahead, the cruel whispers of a town that hadn't met her and would decide they hated her anyway. The slow and painful work of teaching a broken man how to grieve without disappearing into it. The blizzard that was still months away but was already, in some sense, gathering itself somewhere far to the north. She didn't know any of that yet. She only knew that a little girl named Sarah had asked her not to leave, and that for the first time in longer than she could remember, somebody had needed her to stay badly enough to ask. So she would. Whatever this house cost her, whatever this family demanded, whatever Silas Granger's grief and pride and silence threw in her path, Martha Rowan had made her decision, and she was not in the habit of going back on it. The dishes could wait one more hour. Right now, there was a baby to bathe, a silent girl to coax into trusting her, twin boys somewhere on the property who'd been expelled twice for fighting and probably needed watching, and a 16-year-old who'd been mothering 4 siblings for 8 months straight and likely hadn't had a full night's sleep since her own mother died. There was a whole broken household waiting downstairs, and Martha Rowan, 29 years old, plain-faced and stubborn, and finally needed by someone, rolled up her sleeves and got to work. By the time Martha had Ellie bathed and dressed in a nightgown that actually fit instead of one rolled up at the sleeves, the sun was nearly gone, and her arms ached in a way she'd forgotten arms could ache. She carried the baby downstairs, humming something tuneless under her breath, and found the kitchen exactly as she'd left it, dishes piled, floor gritty, Silas Granger nowhere in sight. Mary was sitting at the table peeling potatoes with the kind of mechanical exhaustion that told Martha this was a task she'd done 1,000 times without anyone ever asking if she wanted to. "Where's your father?" "Barn," Mary said, not looking up. "He goes out there when he doesn't know what else to do with himself." "And the twins?" "Probably still hiding from you. They do that with new people. Used to be funny when Ma was alive. She'd play along, make a game out of finding them." Mary's knife slowed on the potato just for a second. "Now they just hide because they're scared you'll leave like the last one." Martha set Ellie down in a wooden high chair that had clearly seen better days and looked at Mary properly for the first time since she'd arrived. Really looked, past the exhaustion and the flat, careful voice, at a girl who should have been worrying about dresses and dances and was instead worrying about whether a stranger would abandon her family. "How old were you when your mother passed?" 15. "I'm 16 now." Mary set down the knife. "She died having Ellie. Fever took her 3 days after the birth. Doctor said there wasn't anything anybody could have done, but Pa doesn't believe that. Hasn't since." "And you've been doing all this," Martha said, gesturing at the kitchen, the high chair, the basin of potatoes, "by yourself." "Somebody had to." Mary's jaw was set in a way that reminded Martha sharply of her father. "Pa tried. He really did. But he'd come in from the fields and just sit, sometimes for an hour, just sit at this table and not say anything, and the babies still needed feeding, and Caroline still needed somebody to braid her hair so it wasn't a mess, so." She shrugged, like it was simple, like it hadn't cost her a childhood. "I did it." Martha felt something hot rise behind her eyes and blinked it back hard. She hadn't come here to cry in front of a 16-year-old who'd clearly had enough adults fall apart in front of her already. "You're not doing it alone anymore," she said instead, and reached for the second knife on the counter. "Budge over. 2 of us will get through these twice as fast." Mary looked at her with something unreadable in her face. Surprise, mostly, like she'd offered to peel potatoes for a girl who'd never once been offered the chance to simply share a chore instead of carrying it. They worked in silence for a while. The only sounds, the scrape of knives and Ellie's contented babbling and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. Martha was good at silence. She'd learned over 29 years that people revealed more in the gaps between sentences than they ever did trying to fill them, and she let this one stretch until Mary spoke again on her own. "Caroline used to talk all the time," she said quietly. "Before. Couldn't get her to be quiet, Ma used to say. She'd narrate everything she was doing, like a little radio program nobody asked for." A small, sad smile. "She stopped the day of the funeral. Hasn't said more than a handful of words since. Has anyone taken her to see a doctor about it?" "We don't have money for doctors that aren't about broken bones," Mary said, flat again, the careful neutrality sliding back over her face like a door closing. "Pa's tried talking to her. She just looks at him. I think she's scared if she starts talking again, she'll have to talk about Ma, and she's not ready." Martha thought about that for a long moment, turning a potato over in her hands without really seeing it. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "people don't need to be made to talk. They just need somebody patient enough to wait until they're ready without making the waiting feel like pressure." "You sound like you've done this before." "I raised my sister's children some summers," Martha said, which was true, though it wasn't the whole truth, and Mary didn't push for more. The back door opened and Silas came in, smelling of hay and horse and the particular sweat of a man who'd gone looking for hard work, specifically because he needed somewhere to put his hands. He stopped short at the sight of his daughter and the housekeeper sitting shoulder to shoulder peeling potatoes like they'd been doing it together for years, and something crossed his face Martha couldn't name. Not quite relief, not quite guilt. Something tangled up between the two. "Mary," he said, "bed soon for the little ones." "I know, Pa." Mary didn't look up. He hesitated in the doorway like a man unsure whether he belonged in his own kitchen. Martha decided she wasn't going to make this easy for him. "Mr. Granger, sit down. There's coffee, if it's drinkable, which I doubt, given the state of that pot." "I can make my own coffee." "I didn't say you couldn't. I said sit down." She nodded toward the chair across from her, the one he'd sat in that afternoon like a man already defeated. "We have things to discuss, and I'd rather discuss them now than let them fester." He sat. Mary glanced between the two of them, gathered Ellie up from the high chair with practiced ease, and made herself scarce with the particular efficiency of a girl who'd learned to read a room for trouble. "All right," Silas said once they were alone, his voice guarded. "Discuss." Martha set down her knife and folded her hands on the table, the way she used to when she negotiated wages with farmers back in Ohio who thought a woman wouldn't know the value of her own labor. "Tomorrow I want to talk to each of your children separately. Not to interrogate them, just to know them, what they like, what scares them, what they need. I can't fix what I don't understand." "All right. I want that porch step repaired by Friday. It's a hazard, and one of these days somebody's going to break an ankle on it. I'll get to it." "You'll get to it Friday," Martha said, "or I will fix it myself with whatever tools I find in that barn, and I imagine neither of us wants that because I expect I'd do it badly and you'd be embarrassed." That got something out of him. Not quite a laugh, but the ghost of one, a brief loosening around his eyes. "Fine. Friday. And I want to talk about Caroline." The loosening vanished. "There's nothing to talk about. She doesn't talk. That's just how she is now." "That's not how she is, Mr. Granger. That's how grief left her, and there's a difference, and I think you know it, because you flinched when I said her name." Silas's hands tightened around the coffee cup Mary had left for him before she disappeared upstairs. "What do you want me to do?" "I've tried. I sit with her. I tell her stories her mother used to tell. She just stares at me like I'm a stranger." "Have you ever asked her how she's feeling? Not told her stories. Asked her something, and then just waited, however long it took, for an answer?" He was quiet for a long moment. "No," he admitted finally. "I suppose I haven't." "Children don't need us to fix their grief, Mr. Granger. Most of the time they need us to simply not be afraid of it. And I think, forgive me for saying this since I've known you all of 6 hours, I think you're afraid of it. Your own and theirs both." His face went hard, the way a man's face goes hard right before pride takes over from honesty. "You don't know anything about it. You're right. I don't know what it is to lose a wife. I don't know what it is to watch 5 children grieve a mother while I'm too buried in my own grief to help them through it." Martha kept her voice level, not unkind, but not backing down either. "But I know what it is to be left, Mr. Granger. I know what it is to watch the people who are supposed to love you decide you're not worth the trouble of staying for. And I'm telling you, as someone who knows that particular ache from the other side of it, your children are not asking you to fix their grief. They're asking you to not disappear into your own." Silas stood up so fast his chair scraped loud against the floor. And for a second, Martha thought she'd pushed too far, thought he'd tell her to pack her bag after all, lie or no lie, child's plea or no child's plea. But he didn't. He stood there with his back to her, shoulders rigid, staring out the dark window at a yard he couldn't see anymore in the dusk. And when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something rougher and quieter than anything she'd heard from him yet. "I keep thinking if I'd been faster," he said. "If I'd ridden for the doctor myself instead of sending Hollis. If I'd known the fever was that bad before the 3rd day. I keep running it over and over, like there's a version of it where I did something different, and she's still here, and every single time I run it, I still can't find the place where I could have saved her." His shoulders shook, just slightly, just once. "So no, I haven't asked my daughter how she's feeling because I don't know how to ask anybody that question, including myself, without falling apart in front of children who've already lost too much to watch their father fall apart too. The kitchen was very quiet. Martha didn't move toward him. She'd learned long ago that some grief needed room, not comfort, not yet. That's the most honest thing you've said to me since I arrived, she said finally. Doesn't change anything. It changes everything, Mr. Granger. A man who can say that out loud is a man who can learn to say smaller, kinder things out loud too. Eventually, to his children. She stood, gathering the potato peelings into the basin. Nobody's asking you to stop grieving. I'm asking you to stop grieving alone in a house full of people who are grieving right alongside you and don't know how to reach you. He didn't answer that. He simply nodded once, stiffly, and walked out the back door into the dark. And Martha let him go, because some things a man needed to sit with by himself before he could carry them inside a house full of other people's eyes. Kids. She found the twins the next morning before either of them found her. Caleb and Cody, 7 years old, identical down to the cowlick at the crown of their heads, currently engaged in a furious, silent standoff over a single wooden top in the dirt beside the barn. "That's mine," one of them hissed. "It's both of ours, Caleb," Ma said. "Ma's not here to say nothing." Caleb's voice cracked on the last word, and Cody's face crumpled in response. And for a second the two boys just stood there, 8 inches apart, both of them furious, and both of them about to cry, and neither of them willing to be the one who did it first. Martha crouched down a respectful distance away. "I had a brother once," she said, to neither boy in particular. "We used to fight over a deck of cards so bad our mother hid it in the chimney for a month, just so we'd stop." Both boys turned to look at her with identical suspicious expressions. "You're the new housekeeper," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. It sounded like an accusation. "I'm Martha." "Sarah said you're staying," Cody said. "Caroline said you're not." "Caroline's wrong this time," Martha said, and held out her hand for the wooden top. After a long considering pause, Caleb dropped it into her palm, more out of curiosity than trust. She turned it over, examining the worn paint, the place where someone's careful hand had carved a small initial into the base. "This is a good top. Somebody made this with love, like Pa made it before." Cody didn't specify before what. He didn't need to. "Well," Martha handed it back to Caleb, who took it without the fight he'd had in him a minute before. "Seems to me a top like this is too good to fight over and break. How about you show me how it works, and we take turns, and whoever's not spinning it gets to count how long it stays up." The boys exchanged a look, the particular wordless conversation only twins seemed able to have, and something in the tension between them eased just slightly. "You count slow," Caleb said, like he was issuing a challenge. "Last housekeeper counted fast, so it looked like the top didn't spin long." "I count exactly as fast as the top spins," Martha said. "No faster, no slower. That's a promise." It was a small thing. She knew it was a small thing, even as she said it, crouched in the dirt beside a leaning barn with 2 grieving boys and a wooden top between them. But she'd learned, somewhere in her 29 years of being overlooked and underestimated, that trust wasn't built in grand gestures. It was built in promises so small nobody else would have thought to make them, kept exactly as small and exact as they'd been offered. She counted the spin. Out loud, slow, careful. The boys watched the top with the kind of focus only children have for things that don't matter to anyone but them. And when it finally wobbled and fell, Cody whooped and Caleb scowled and demanded a rematch. And for 10 whole minutes, in the dirt outside a sagging barn, 2 boys who'd been expelled twice for fighting forgot they had any reason to. She found Caroline harder to reach. The girl spent most mornings in the small bedroom she shared with Sarah, sitting by the window with a book she didn't seem to be reading, watching the yard below like she was waiting for something that wasn't coming. Martha didn't push. She brought a basket of mending up to the room on the second day and simply sat on the floor near the window, not looking at Caroline, working a needle through a torn shirt collar like she had nowhere else in the world she needed to be. "You don't have to talk to me," she said, after a while, not looking up from her stitching. "I'm not going to ask you to. I just thought you might like some company while I work, since this room's a sight more pleasant than that kitchen." Caroline said nothing, but she didn't leave either, and Martha counted that as something. This went on for 3 days. Martha sitting with her mending, talking lightly about nothing in particular, the weather, The Chickens That Needed a Proper Coop, a story about her sister Ruth's youngest who'd once put a frog in the church collection plate, never once demanding a response. On the fourth day, as Martha was threading a needle and complaining good-naturedly about how Wyoming thread seemed determined to fight her, Caroline spoke. "Ma used to hate sewing too," she said. Her voice was rusty, like a door that hadn't opened in months. She said her stitches always looked like a drunk spider had been at them. Martha kept her eyes on her work, careful not to startle the moment into silence again. "Sounds like your mother and I would have gotten along. She would have liked you," Caroline said, and then, like the words had cost her something enormous, she pressed her lips together and looked back out the window, and didn't say anything else that day. But it was a start. Martha carried that small, rusty sentence around with her for the rest of the afternoon like something precious. And that night, washing dishes after supper, she found herself smiling for no reason anyone in the kitchen could see. The town of Larkspur, when Martha finally saw it on her first supply run with Jacob driving the wagon, was smaller than she'd expected. A single dusty main street, a mercantile, a church, a saloon that did double duty as the only restaurant for 30 miles. It didn't take long to learn that the town had opinions about the Granger Ranch, and stronger opinions still about the strange woman who'd shown up there. "That's her," she heard a woman whisper to another outside the mercantile, not quietly enough. "The one Silas Granger brought out from back east. Housekeeper, my foot. You don't bring a housekeeper out from Ohio when there's perfectly good local women who'd do it for half the wage." "Heard she's not even pretty," the second woman said, and there was something almost gleeful in it, the particular cruelty of small towns with not enough scandal to go around. "Heard he must have been desperate to take whatever showed up." Martha kept her chin level and her steps even and didn't let her face show what those words did to something old and tender in her chest, a wound she'd thought had scarred over years ago in Ohio, and apparently hadn't, not all the way. "Don't listen to them," Jacob muttered as they loaded flour sacks into the wagon. "They talk about everybody like that. They talked about Ma like that too when she first married Pa. Said she was too citified to last a winter out here." A small, fierce pride flickered across his face. "She lasted 11 winters." "Did she?" Martha said softly. She wasn't scared of what people said. "Pa says that's what he loved about her." Jacob hesitated, then added, almost too quiet to hear, "You don't seem scared of it either." Martha looked at this boy who'd been so guarded with her on the wagon ride out, 3 days ago now, though it felt like longer, and saw something shifting in him. Not trust yet, not quite, but the beginning of something willing to consider it. "I've had a lot of practice not being scared of it," she said. "People decided a long time ago what they thought of me before they ever knew me. You learn to stop letting it decide things for you instead." Jacob didn't say anything to that, but he climbed up onto the wagon bench beside her instead of in the back where he usually rode, and that too Martha counted as something. The whispers followed her home, in a manner of speaking. Not literally, but in the way town gossip always finds its way back to a ranch eventually, carried by a neighbor's offhand comment or a churchgoer's pointed silence. By the second week, Martha had stopped pretending she didn't notice the way certain women in Larkspur looked at her, the way conversations went quiet when she walked into the mercantile, the way one particularly sharp-tongued woman named Edith Calloway made a point of asking, loud enough for half the store to hear, whether Silas Granger had finally given up on finding a proper wife and settled for hired help instead. Martha had set down the bolt of fabric she was examining, met Edith Calloway's eyes directly, and said with perfect pleasantness, "I'm not his wife, ma'am. I'm the woman keeping 5 grieving children fed and clothed while half this town finds time to gossip about it instead of bringing so much as a casserole. I'd think you'd have your priorities a little better sorted, but I suppose that's not my business to say." The store had gone dead silent, and Edith Calloway's face had gone an interesting shade of red, and Martha had paid for her thread and walked out with her head high, shaking only slightly once she was safely back in the wagon. She didn't tell Silas about it. She didn't need to. Word traveled fast in a town that size, and by the time she'd finished supper preparations 2 days later, he was standing in the kitchen doorway with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something that might have been respect, mixed up with something that might have been worry. "Heard you had words with Edith Calloway." "I had facts with Edith Calloway. She had words. There's a difference." The corner of his mouth twitched, the closest thing to a real smile she'd gotten out of him yet. "She's been the terror of this town since before my wife and I married. Nobody's stood up to her in years. Folks just let her talk." I don't have much patience for people who talk about children's well-being as a way of starting gossip about adults, Martha said, more sharply than she meant to, and then, softening, "Your children don't need this town's approval, Mr. Granger. They need food and warmth and somebody to braid Caroline's hair properly, which, I'll have you know, has been a disaster since I arrived, because apparently nobody in this house owns a hairbrush with all its bristles." That, finally, got a real laugh out of him. Short, rusty, like the laugh hadn't been used in a long while, and wasn't sure it remembered how. It transformed his whole face for a second, took 10 years off it, and Martha found herself staring before she caught herself and looked back down at the stew she was stirring. "I'll get a hairbrush," Silas said. "Next supply run." "See that you do." He lingered in the doorway a moment longer than the conversation required, like there was something else he wanted to say and couldn't find the shape of it, and then he simply nodded and went back out to whatever evening chore was waiting, and Martha told herself the warmth in her chest was just the stove, just the heat of cooking, nothing more complicated than that. She mostly believed it. The real turning point, the one Martha would think back on later as the moment the house properly began to come back to life, happened on a Sunday almost 3 weeks after she'd arrived, when Ellie, who had cried herself to exhaustion nearly every single night since Martha had taken over her bedtime routine, finally slept through an entire night without waking once. Martha realized it slowly, the way you realize silence rather than notice it. She woke at her usual hour expecting the thin, tired wail from down the hall, and instead heard nothing, and lay there in the dark for a long moment with her heart pounding, certain something was wrong, before she got up and crept to the nursery and found Ellie sleeping soundly, one small fist curled against her cheek, breathing slow and even and peaceful for the first time since her mother had died. Martha stood in the doorway and cried, quietly, the kind of crying that comes from relief so deep it has nowhere else to go. She didn't hear Silas come up behind her until he was standing in the hallway, drawn by some instinct of his own, looking past her at his sleeping daughter with an expression that undid something in his face entirely. "She's not crying," he said, like he couldn't quite trust it. "She's not crying," Martha agreed, wiping her eyes quickly, embarrassed to be caught. They stood there together in the dark hallway, close enough that Martha could feel the warmth of him beside her, watching a baby sleep peacefully for the first time in 8 months, and neither of them said anything else, because there wasn't anything that needed saying. Some moments were complete on their own, without commentary, without anyone reaching for a word big enough to hold them. It wouldn't be the last hard night. It wouldn't be the last cruel word from Larkspur, or the last silent meal where Caroline's grief sat thick in the room, or the last time Silas Granger disappeared into the barn because the weight of his own house was too much to carry inside it. There was still so much broken in the Granger household that one peaceful night couldn't fix it all. But standing in that dark hallway listening to a baby breathe easy for the first time in months, Martha Rowan understood, with a certainty that surprised her by how little it frightened her, that something in this house had already begun to heal. Slowly, imperfectly, the way real healing always happened. Not all at once, but one quiet, ordinary miracle at a time. October came in mild that year, mild enough that Silas said out loud, more than once, that he didn't trust it. Martha had laughed at him the first time he said it, standing in the yard with a basket of laundry on her hip, the sky overhead so blue and unbothered it didn't seem capable of holding a storm in it anywhere. "You're worrying for nothing," she told him. "Look at it. Not a cloud. That's exactly why I'm worried." He was squinting up at the horizon, at something Martha couldn't see, some instinct built from years of working this land that she hadn't earned yet. "Wyoming doesn't give you mild for free. It's saving up for something." She'd teased him about it again 2 days later and again the day after that, until the teasing became its own small ritual between them. A shorthand, almost, the kind of private joke that grows between two people who've started, without quite admitting it to themselves, to look forward to each other's company. It had crept up on both of them slowly over the weeks. The easy laughter at supper, the way Silas had started fixing things around the house without being asked twice, not just the porch step, which he'd repaired exactly on the Friday she'd demanded, but the sagging clothesline, the chicken coop he'd finally built so the hens stopped roaming loose through the yard, small repairs that added up to something larger than the sum of their boards and nails. The way Martha had started saving him a plate when he worked late, and he'd started thanking her for it like it mattered more than food. Neither of them had said anything about what that meant. There was too much else in the house demanding attention. Caroline, who was speaking more now but still carefully, like she was rationing words she wasn't sure she'd get back. The twins, who still fought but fought less, and cried less too, now that somebody counted their spinning top out loud exactly as fast as it spun. Mary, who Martha had started teaching to read properly past her 6th grade schooling, both of them bent over a borrowed book at the kitchen table some evenings, while Silas mended harness leather nearby, listening more than he let on. So when the sky finally turned, nobody in the Granger house was as ready as they should have been. It started with the wind. Martha noticed it first while she was pulling laundry off the line, a sharp gust that came out of nowhere and snapped a wet shirt against her face hard enough to sting. She looked up and saw the horizon had changed entirely from the morning, a wall of gray-green cloud building fast over the western ridge, the kind of cloud that didn't look like weather so much as a living thing, rolling toward the ranch with a purpose. "Silas!" She didn't usually call him by his first name, not where the children could hear, but the wind tore the formality right out of her. "Silas, look at this!" He came around the side of the barn already moving fast, already reading the sky the way she'd learned over 2 months that he could read 100 things about this land she still couldn't see. His face went tight. "That's not mild," he said. "That's a blue norther coming in fast. Jacob, get the horses in now, all of them, and check the cattle in the near pasture." The next hour dissolved into a kind of organized chaos Martha would remember in pieces afterward, like a dream remembered in fragments. The temperature dropped so fast it felt physically violent, the warm October afternoon collapsing into something that bit at exposed skin within minutes. Silas was shouting orders. To Jacob, to the hands he'd managed to rehire that fall, now that the ranch was finally turning a small profit again. To Martha herself, who found herself hauling firewood and battening shutters with the particular focused calm she discovered she had in emergencies. The panic locked somewhere down deep where it couldn't slow her hands. "The herd's still out on the far range," Silas said, grabbing his coat, his rifle, a coil of rope. His voice had the flat, controlled urgency of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. 300 head, maybe more. If this storm's as bad as it looks, we lose them. We lose the whole season. Maybe the ranch." "You're not going out in that," Martha said, and heard her own voice come out sharper and more frightened than she meant it to. "I have to. Silas." She caught his arm before he could move past her, and he stopped, surprised by the contact, by the rawness in her face. "Look at that sky. You said yourself it's a bad one. That's why I have to go now, before it gets worse." He held her eyes for a moment, and something passed between them that neither of them had words for yet, something that had been building quietly under the surface of 2 months of laundry and laughter and shared suppers. "Martha, I need you to keep the children safe. That's the job only you can do right now. Mine's out there." She wanted to argue. Every instinct in her screamed to argue, to grab his coat and refuse to let go, but she'd learned enough about this man in 2 months to know that arguing wouldn't move him, not when 300 head of cattle and the whole survival of his ranch hung in the balance, not when he'd spent 8 months already failing, in his own mind, to save the person who mattered most to him, and would tear himself in half before he let that happen twice. "Take Jacob," she said instead. "Don't go alone. Jacob's coming. He knows the range as well as I do now." Silas's jaw worked, and for just a second the wall he kept around himself cracked, and she saw the fear underneath it. Not fear of the storm, she realized, but fear of leaving her, of leaving the children, of one more loss he wouldn't be able to undo. "If something happens—" "Nothing's going to happen," Martha said, more fiercely than she felt. "You're going to bring those cattle in, and you're going to come back here, and I am going to have supper hot and waiting, and that is the entire plan. Do you understand me?" Something in his face loosened, just barely, at the steel in her voice. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and for one strange, suspended second, in the middle of a gathering storm, with everything at stake, it almost sounded like he was teasing her, and she almost smiled despite the fear sitting cold in her stomach. Then he was gone. Swinging up onto his horse with Jacob close behind him, both of them disappearing into a wind that was already turning the world white at the edges. And Martha stood in the yard for one long moment, watching the place where they'd vanished, before she turned and ran back toward the house, because there were 5 children inside who needed her now more than her fear did. The storm hit in full within the hour, and it hit harder than anything Martha had ever experienced in her life. The wind screamed around the corners of the house with a sound like something alive and furious, hurling snow sideways so thick the barn, 50 yards from the back door, simply disappeared from view entirely. The temperature kept dropping. Martha kept the fires burning in every room she could manage, stuffed rags along the bottom of doors where the wind found its way through cracks she hadn't noticed before, and gathered all 5 children into the parlor where the big stone fireplace threw the most heat. "Is Pa going to be all right?" Sarah asked, pressed against Martha's side on the settee, her small voice tight with the particular fear children get when the adults around them are pretending to be calmer than they are. "Your father's been working this land a long time," Martha said, keeping her voice steady even as the wind shrieked outside hard enough to rattle the window panes. "He knows this storm better than the storm knows itself." It wasn't entirely true. Nobody knew a storm like this. Not really. Not the way you knew a person. But Sarah needed something to hold on to, and Martha had learned, 2 months into this house, that sometimes love meant handing a frightened child a steadier truth than the one you were actually carrying yourself. Caroline sat very still by the fire, her arms wrapped around her knees, watching the flames with an intensity that worried Martha more than tears would have. She went and sat beside her, close enough to offer warmth without crowding. "You're thinking about your mother," Martha said quietly. It wasn't a question. Caroline's chin trembled just slightly. "She died fast," she whispered. "The fever. Pa says it was fast, but it didn't feel fast. It felt like it took forever and then it was over before anybody got to say goodbye properly." Her eyes were wet, fixed on the fire. What if Pa doesn't come back fast either? What if it takes forever, and then it's just over? Martha pulled the girl against her side, and for once, Caroline didn't go stiff at the contact, just leaned in, small and shaking. "I can't promise you nothing bad will ever happen again," Martha said, because she'd decided early on that she would not lie to these children the way the world had already lied to them enough. "I wish I could, but I can promise you that your father is the most stubborn man I have ever met in my life, and stubborn men do not die easy in storms because they're too busy arguing with the weather to let it win." It startled a small, wet laugh out of Caroline, the kind of laugh that arrives uninvited, surprising the person who makes it as much as the person who hears it. And Martha held on to that sound like a lifeline of her own, because the truth was, underneath her calm voice and her steady hands, she was every bit as frightened as the child in her arms. The hours that followed were the longest of Martha's life. She fed the children supper by firelight when the lamps started guttering low on oil she didn't dare waste, told stories to keep the twins from working themselves into a panic, hummed Ellie to sleep against her shoulder while the wind tried its level best to tear the roof off the house. She checked the clock on the mantel more times than she could count, watching the hands crawl past the hour Silas should have been back, then 2 hours, then 3. The fear in her chest growing colder and heavier with every passing minute, until it sat in her like a stone she could barely breathe around. It was nearly midnight, the children finally asleep in a tangled pile of blankets on the parlor floor, where Martha had been afraid to send them to separate cold bedrooms, when she heard it. A sound under the wind, faint and broken, a horse's frantic whinny somewhere near the barn. She was up and moving before she'd decided to move, grabbing a lantern and her coat, wrenching the back door open against a wind that fought her for every inch, and there in the white howling chaos of the yard, she saw 2 shapes stumbling toward the house, one of them upright and moving fast, the other slumped heavy against him, barely staying on its feet. "Jacob!" Her voice tore away in the wind almost before it left her mouth, but he heard her, turned toward the light of her lantern. "He's hurt!" Jacob shouted back, his young voice cracking with exhaustion and fear in equal measure. "Help me, I can't. He won't stay up." Martha was across the yard in seconds, snow stinging her face, and got her shoulder under Silas's other arm just as his knees buckled. He was barely conscious, his face gray-white in the lantern light, blood frozen dark and stiff along one side of his head, his right arm hanging at an angle that made Martha's stomach drop. "What happened?" she gasped, half dragging him toward the door with Jacob straining on the other side. "Horse went down. Ice under the snow. We didn't see it. Pa went down with her. His arm." Jacob's words came in broken pieces, shock and cold making him stumble over them. "We got the herd in. Most of them. He wouldn't leave till the last of them was through the gate, even after he fell. He kept saying we couldn't lose them. We couldn't. They got him through the door and onto the kitchen table. The children stirring awake in the parlor at the commotion, Mary appearing in the doorway with her face going white at the sight of her father's blood on the lantern light. Mary, get the children back to the parlor. Keep them there. Do not let the little ones see this, Martha said, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. The same locked-down calm that had carried her through the panic of battening shutters hours before. Jacob, I need clean water, as hot as you can get it fast, and every bit of cloth you can find. Now. There was no doctor for 30 miles in good weather, and this was not good weather. There would be no riding for one tonight, not with the storm still screaming outside and the roads buried under drifts that would swallow a horse whole. Whatever happened to Silas Granger in the next several hours, it would happen with Martha Rowan's hands and nothing else. She had never set a broken bone in her life. She had bandaged scraped knees and stitched the occasional cut, the ordinary first aid of a woman who'd helped raise her sister's children. But nothing like this. Nothing with stakes this enormous sitting unconscious on her kitchen table with his face the color of ash. You can do this, she said to herself, low, under her breath, hands shaking as she cut away the frozen, blood-stiff fabric from the wound on his head. You can do this, Martha. There is nobody else. So you can. The gash on his scalp was ugly but shallow, more blood than danger, the kind of wound that looked far worse than it was. She cleaned it carefully, packed it, wrapped it tight, and Silas groaned and stirred under her hands, his eyes fluttering half open, glassy and unfocused. Martha, he rasped, like her name was the only solid thing he could find to hold on to in the fog of pain. I'm here, I'm right here. Don't move, your arm's broken. I need you to stay still. Cattle, he muttered, fighting to sit up despite everything, despite the gray pallor of his skin and the obvious agony the movement cost him. Did we get the cattle? The cattle are fine, you stubborn man. Now lie still before I tie you to this table myself. That somehow broke through the haze enough to get a weak, pained huff out of him that might have been a laugh, and he lay back down, and Martha turned her attention to his arm, which was swollen and wrong-angled below the elbow in a way that made her hands go cold just looking at it. Jacob hovered at her shoulder, white-faced. Is he going to be all right? I need you to hold his shoulders steady. Both hands, brace him hard, and don't let go no matter what sound he makes. Can you do that? Jacob nodded, jaw tight, and gripped his father's shoulder the way Martha showed him. Silas. She took his good hand in hers, met his glassy eyes, made him hold her gaze. I have to set this. It's going to hurt worse than anything's hurt you in a long while, and I'm sorry for that, but it has to be done tonight, or it heals wrong and you lose the use of it for good. I need you to trust me. I trust you, he said, low and rough. And there was something in the way he said it, not just about the arm, not just about this single terrible night, but about every day of the 2 months before it, every small repair and shared supper and rusty laugh she'd coaxed out of him. That steadied Martha's hands more than anything else could have. She set the bone. He screamed once, sharp and brief, and then went limp, mercifully unconscious again, and Martha splinted the arm with strips of wood Jacob tore from a crate and bound it tight, her own hands not shaking now, not anymore, steady with the particular focus of a person who has decided she will not fall apart until the work is finished. The night that followed was the longest one the Granger house had seen since the night Silas's wife had died. Martha sat beside him at the kitchen table, then helped Jacob move him to the bed once he'd stabilized enough, and kept watch through the dark hours while the storm raged on outside and the fire burned low and had to be fed again and again. He drifted in and out of consciousness, fever rising as the night wore toward morning, and twice he said his dead wife's name in his sleep, low and broken, and Martha held his good hand both times and didn't let go, even when it wasn't her hand he was reaching for in his fever dreams. Near dawn, as the wind outside finally began to ease into something less furious, he woke clearer than he had all night, his eyes finding her in the gray early light with a focus that hadn't been there before. You stayed up all night, he said, voice hoarse. Somebody had to make sure you didn't try standing up and ruining all my hard work. A weak smile crossed his face, there and gone. The advertisement, he said, after a moment, like the fever and the long dark hours had stripped something away that he'd been guarding too carefully before. I need to tell you the truth about it. The whole truth, not just the parts I let myself say that first day. Silas, you don't have to do this now. I do. His good hand found hers again, gripped it. It was never really for a housekeeper, Martha. I told myself it was, because that felt like something a reasonable man could ask for. But the truth is, I wrote that advertisement at 2 a.m. after Ellie had cried herself sick for the third night running, and Caroline hadn't spoken in 6 weeks, and the twins had just gotten suspended again, and Mary fell asleep crying at this same table because she was so tired she couldn't even make it up the stairs. I wasn't looking for someone to clean my floors. I was looking for someone to save a family that was falling apart faster than I could hold it together. And I didn't have the courage to write that down, because writing it down meant admitting I'd already failed at it alone. Martha's eyes burned. You didn't fail, Silas. I would have, if you hadn't stayed. His grip on her hand tightened, weak but certain. You looked at this broken house and these broken children, and you didn't run. Even after I lied to get you here. Even after that town treated you like dirt for trying to help us. I don't know what I did to deserve that kind of staying. I don't think I did anything. I think you're just better than most people get the chance to be. Stop talking, Martha said, her voice thick. Before you say something you'll regret once that fever breaks, and you remember you're a proud, stubborn man who doesn't usually say things like that out loud. I won't regret it, he said, quiet and certain in a way that settled deep into her chest and stayed there. I've had 2 months to think it, Martha. I'm just finally tired enough and scared enough and grateful enough to say it instead of just thinking it. Outside, the storm had finally spent itself, the wind dying to something almost gentle, gray morning light beginning to climb over a yard buried in drifts higher than the porch rail. The world outside scoured clean and white and strangely peaceful after a night that had nearly taken everything from the people inside this house. Martha sat there holding the hand of a man who had brought her here on a lie and had, somehow, in 2 short months, become the truest thing she'd ever found. And she understood, with a clarity that frightened her a little with how complete it was, that whatever home meant, whatever she'd been searching for back in Ruth's kitchen in Ohio with that creased newspaper page in her coat pocket, she had found it here, in this ruined, healing, fiercely loved house, long before either of them had dared to give it a name. Silas's arm stayed in its splint for 6 weeks, and Martha learned during those weeks that a man forced to slow down was a man who finally had no choice but to look at his own house clearly. He couldn't work the fields one-handed, couldn't ride for long with his head still mending, so he sat at the kitchen table more often than he ever had before and watched and started noticing things he'd been too buried in grief to see. He noticed Caroline laughing at something Sarah said, a real laugh. Not the careful, rationed sound she'd been giving the family for months. He noticed the twins fighting less and helping more, hauling firewood together without being told, racing each other to see who could stack a neater pile. He noticed Mary humming while she worked, an old tune her mother used to sing, and he noticed that Martha had taught her 3 new stitches and a recipe for biscuits that didn't come out like stones, and that his 16-year-old daughter, for the first time in 8 months, looked like a girl who had room left over in her day for something besides survival. You did this, he said to Martha one evening in late November, watching from his chair by the fire as she helped Ellie stack wooden blocks on the rug, the baby shrieking with delighted laughter every time the tower fell. I didn't do anything you couldn't have done eventually, Martha said, not looking up. I just had fewer things in my way. Don't do that. His voice was quiet but firm. Don't make yourself smaller than what you are. This house was dying when you walked into it, Martha. I watched it happen for 8 months and couldn't stop it. You stopped it in 8 weeks. She didn't have an answer for that, not one she trusted herself to say out loud without her voice cracking, so she busied herself restacking Ellie's blocks instead, and let the moment settle into the quiet, comfortable silence that had grown between them over the months, the kind of silence 2 people only earn after they've weathered something together that neither of them will ever fully explain to anyone who wasn't there. It was 3 days before Christmas when the letter arrived. Jacob brought it back from town along with the mail and supplies, a thick envelope with unfamiliar handwriting and a postmark from Pennsylvania, and Martha turned it over twice in her hands before she recognized the return address. Her late aunt's lawyer, a name she hadn't thought of in years, attached to an aunt she'd barely known, a woman who'd moved east before Martha was even born and existed in family stories more than memory. She read the letter alone in her room that night, twice, then a third time to make sure she hadn't misunderstood it. Her aunt had died in the autumn, no children of her own, and had left her modest estate, a house in Philadelphia, a small but respectable sum of money, enough to live comfortably and independently for the rest of her life if she was careful. Entirely to Martha, the niece she'd apparently kept track of from a distance for years without either of them ever knowing it. Martha sat on the edge of her bed with the letter trembling in her hands and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not joy, not relief, but a kind of dread so sudden and complete it nearly stole her breath. For 29 years she had been the woman nobody chose, the woman who took what work was offered because nothing better was likely to come along, the woman whose future had always been decided by other people's needs rather than her own wants. And now, out of nowhere, she held in her hands the one thing she'd never had before in her life, a real choice, a house of her own, money enough to never again depend on anyone's charity or anyone's advertisement, true or false. Freedom, complete and unearned and terrifying. She didn't sleep that night. But she told Silas the next morning in the kitchen before the children were awake, because she couldn't carry the weight of the letter alone for one more hour. He read it slowly, his splinted arm awkward against the table, his face giving away nothing until he set it down and looked up at her. "This is good news," he said carefully, like a man testing the ice on a pond before he trusted his weight to it. "Isn't it?"
"I don't know what it is," Martha admitted. "I came out here with one travel bag, Silas. I never expected to have anywhere else to be." "And now you do." His jaw was tight, his eyes steady on hers, even though Martha could see what it cost him to hold that steadiness. "You should take it. The house, the money. It's a life, Martha, an independent one, the kind you've never gotten the chance to have. You'd be a fool not to think about it seriously." "You're telling me to leave."
"I'm telling you that you deserve the choice," he said, and his voice cracked just slightly on the last word, betraying the calm he was working so hard to keep. "I'm not going to be the man who guilts a woman into staying in a house full of someone else's children because he's too scared of losing her to let her go fairly. You've given this family more than I had any right to ask for. If your aunt's left you a way out, a real one, you take it with my blessing, even if—" He stopped himself, looked down at his hands. "Even if it breaks something in me to say so." Martha felt her eyes sting. "And the children?" "The children love you," Silas said, quiet and raw. "That's not a debt you owe them, Martha. That's just true, whether you stay or go. They'll grieve you leaving the way they've grieved everything else, and they'll survive it because you've taught them how to survive things better than I ever could. I won't use that against you to keep you here out of guilt." It was, Martha realized, the single most generous thing anyone had ever said to her, and it nearly undid her completely. Not because it gave her permission to leave, but because it proved, beyond any doubt, exactly what kind of man Silas Granger had become in the months since she'd walked into his ruined kitchen and called his lie out to his face. A man who would rather lose her honestly than keep her through fear. A man who had learned, somewhere in the wreckage of his grief, how to love something more than he loved his own comfort. She didn't answer him that morning. She told him she needed time to think, and he nodded and didn't press her, and that too told her something about how far he'd come from the man who'd lied in a newspaper advertisement because he hadn't trusted the truth to be enough. She spent the next several days walking the ranch alone in the cold, turning the decision over in her mind the way she'd once turned over that creased newspaper page in Ruth's kitchen. She walked past the chicken coop Silas had built with his own hands, past the porch step he'd fixed exactly on the Friday she'd demanded, past the spot in the yard where two grieving twin boys had learned to spin a wooden top side by side instead of fighting over it. She stood at the fence line and watched the cattle Silas had nearly died saving, breath fogging in the cold December air, and thought about Philadelphia, a city she'd never seen, a house she'd never set foot in, an independence she'd spent her whole life wanting and had never once been offered. She thought about Caroline, who had finally 2 weeks ago told Martha a whole story about her mother without stopping halfway through it, the first whole story she'd told anyone since the funeral. She thought about Mary, 16 years old and finally allowed to be 16 again, laughing at the kitchen table over a book instead of carrying a household alone. She thought about the twins, who no longer fought like their fists were the only language left to them. She thought about Sarah, who still slept better with the lamp left burning low. and who had grabbed Martha's hand on the very first day and asked her, with the plain, devastating honesty only a child possesses, not to leave. And she thought about Silas, not the broken, exhausted man who'd lied to bring her here, but the man who'd held her hand in a fever and told her the truth about that lie. The man who'd offered her freedom, even though it might cost him everything, because he loved her too much to make her stay out of guilt. She found him in the barn on the fourth day, mending a bridle one-handed with the kind of stubborn determination that no longer surprised her, and she stood in the doorway for a long moment just watching him before she spoke. "I've made my decision," she said. He set down the bridle slowly, his face carefully blank in a way that told her exactly how much he was bracing himself. "All right. I'm not going to Philadelphia." Something in his shoulders dropped, just slightly, relief he couldn't quite hide fast enough. "Martha, you don't have to decide that because of us. I meant what I said." "I know you meant it," she said, crossing the barn toward him. "That's exactly why I'm staying, Silas. Not because I owe you, and not because 5 children need somebody to keep their house. I've had a long time to think about what a real choice feels like, since I've never had one before. And I realized something standing out at that fence line 3 days ago, freezing half to death and arguing with myself." She stopped a few feet from him, close enough to see the hope he was trying so hard to keep out of his eyes. "My whole life, I thought independence meant having a place that was entirely mine, where I didn't owe anyone anything, and nobody could leave me because there was nothing to leave. But that's not freedom, Silas. That's just a different kind of being alone, dressed up nicer. Martha, I have a real choice now, for the first time in my life," she continued, her voice steadying even as her heart pounded. "And given a real choice, freely, with nothing forcing my hand, I choose this. I choose this house, and these children, and you, stubborn and proud, and finally honest with me. I choose it because I want it, not because anybody needs me to." Silas crossed the remaining distance between them in 2 steps, his good hand coming up to cup her face like he still couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "I love you," he said simply, like the words had been sitting ready in him for weeks, waiting for permission. "I think I've loved you since the night you set my arm and didn't let your hand shake until the work was done. I should have said it sooner. I was scared of what it meant after everything." "After your wife," Martha said gently, no jealousy in it, only understanding. "After my wife," he agreed, quiet. "I thought loving somebody again meant betraying what I had with her. It took me a long time and a broken arm and an aunt I never met in Pennsylvania to understand that's not how it works. Loving you doesn't erase loving her. It just means I'm not done living yet, and I don't want to keep living it alone." "I'm not asking you to choose me over her memory," Martha said. "I never wanted that. I just want a place in the family you're still building, alongside everything that came before me." "Then stay," Silas said. And it wasn't a request this time, not exactly. It was something steadier than that, something closer to a vow already half-formed. "Not as a housekeeper, not even just as someone the children love. Marry me, Martha. Be their mother in truth, not just in everything but name. Let me spend whatever years I've got left proving I deserve the woman who walked into my ruined house on a lie and decided to stay anyway." Martha laughed, startled and wet-eyed all at once, the sound echoing soft against the barn rafters. "You're terrible at proposals, you know that? You're standing in a barn that smells like horse, with one arm still in a sling, asking a woman to marry you like it's a business arrangement you're trying to settle before supper. Is that a no?" "It's a yes," Martha said, and the word came out easier than any decision she'd ever made in her life. Easier than the wagon ride to Wyoming, easier than staying that first terrible afternoon, because this time there was no fear underneath it at all, just a certainty so complete it felt like coming home to a place she'd never actually lived before. "It's absolutely, completely yes, Silas Granger." He kissed her then, careful with his splinted arm, clumsy and a little desperate and entirely real. And somewhere outside the barn door, Martha heard a sharp gasp, followed by a stampede of small running feet, and pulled back to find all 5 children crowded in the doorway, having apparently followed Silas out to the barn and arrived just in time to witness the whole thing. "Are you going to be our ma now?" Sarah asked, breathless, hardly daring to hope it out loud. Martha crouched down, the way she had that very first day in the kitchen, and held out her arms, and Sarah ran into them without a second's hesitation, followed quickly by the twins, who'd apparently decided whatever objections 7-year-old boys might have to sentiment were worth setting aside for this. Caroline came more slowly, but she came, wrapping her arms around Martha's neck and whispering, just for her, "I knew it. I knew you weren't going to leave." Mary stood a little apart, 16 and trying hard to look composed, and it was Martha who reached for her first, pulling her into the circle of the embrace. And Mary finally let herself cry. Not the careful, controlled tears she'd allowed herself in 8 months of holding a broken family together, but real ones. The kind of girl is finally allowed to cry once she knows, for certain, that somebody else has taken up the weight she'd been carrying alone. Silas stood watching them all, his children and the woman who'd become their mother in everything but name, tangled together on the floor of a barn that smelled like horse and hay and hope. And Martha looked up at him over the heads of 5 children who had chosen her as completely as she had chosen them, and understood that this, finally, after 29 years of being overlooked and underestimated and left behind, was what it felt like to be wanted not out of need, not out of desperation, not out of a lie printed in a newspaper, but simply, plainly, entirely for who she was. She had come to Wyoming carrying 1 travel bag and a creased newspaper page, expecting nothing more than wages and a roof. She was leaving that barn with a family that had chosen her completely, a future she had chosen freely, and a kind of belonging she had stopped believing, somewhere along the long road of her 29 years, that she would ever be allowed to have. Word of the engagement reached Larkspur before the week was out, the way all news did in a town that small, and Martha braced herself for the same cruelty that had followed her through the mercantile that first month. She got some of it. Edith Calloway, predictably, had opinions about a hired housekeeper marrying her way into a rancher's bed within 5 months of arriving, and she shared those opinions with anyone who'd stand still long enough to hear them. But something had shifted that Martha hadn't expected, and it took her a while to understand it for what it was. The same neighbors who'd whispered about her plainness and her presumption back in October started showing up at the ranch with casseroles and quilts and offers of help with the wedding, and at first Martha thought it was pity or curiosity or the particular hunger small towns have for being close to a story everyone's talking about. It wasn't until she overheard 2 women talking outside the mercantile in January while she waited for Jacob to load supplies that she understood it for what it actually was. "Caroline Granger spoke a whole paragraph to me yesterday," one woman was saying, clearly still a little amazed by it. "Asked after my garden, plain as anything. That child hadn't said 3 words together since her mother passed, not to anybody in this town. And those twins aren't getting sent home from school anymore," the other added. "Mrs. Whitfield says they're the best-behaved boys in her classroom most days now. Hard to believe, the way they used to carry on. Whatever you think about how it happened," the first woman said, lowering her voice like she was confessing something. "That woman saved that family. Saved it plain. I don't care how she got out here." Martha hadn't said anything, hadn't let on she'd heard, but she carried those words home with her like something precious, turning them over the same way she'd once turned over a creased newspaper advertisement in her sister's kitchen. It wasn't approval she'd been chasing. She'd told herself that from the very first week, and she'd meant it. But it was a strange kind of relief anyway, to know that the work she'd done in that house hadn't gone unnoticed by the very people who'd been so quick to doubt her. Not everyone came around. Edith Calloway never did. Not really, though even she showed up to the wedding in March, sour-faced and dutiful, because in a town that small you didn't skip the wedding of the man who supplied half the beef to the local butcher, whatever you privately thought of his choice in wife. Martha decided, watching her sit stiffly in the back pew that morning, that some people simply weren't worth the effort of winning over, and that the trying to win them had cost her more peace in those first weeks than their opinions had ever been worth. The wedding itself was small, held in the yard rather than the church, because Sarah had cried real tears at the idea of getting married anywhere but home, and Martha hadn't had the heart to argue with that particular request. Silas's arm had healed enough by March to come out of its splint entirely, though he still favored it slightly when he was tired, a small, permanent reminder of the night the storm had nearly taken everything from them. They married on a Saturday morning with the last of the snow still clinging stubborn to the shaded corners of the yard and the first green shoots of spring already pushing up everywhere else, as if the land itself couldn't decide whether to let go of winter or rush toward summer, and had settled for one brief morning on something in between that felt exactly right for the occasion. Ruth had come, all the way from Ohio with her husband and her 4 children in tow, a journey she'd sworn up and down in her letters she'd never make for anybody. And she'd cried through most of the ceremony in a way that embarrassed her almost as much as it touched Martha. "You wrote me that letter back in the autumn," Ruth said afterward, pulling Martha aside during the small gathering that followed, the yard full of neighbors and casserole dishes, and children running wild between the legs of adults trying to have conversations. The one about the man and his 5 children, and the lie in the advertisement. I remember thinking, well, that's my sister, walking straight into trouble the way she always does. "I didn't walk into trouble," Martha said, laughing despite herself. "I walked into a family." "You walked into both," Ruth said. "Same as you've always done your whole life, finding the hardest road and taking it because nobody else would. I used to worry about that in you. Thought it meant you didn't know how to choose easy things for yourself." She looked across the yard where Silas stood with Jacob, both of them laughing at something one of the hired men had said, easy and unguarded in a way Ruth had certainly never seen in her sister's letters before this past year. "I don't worry about it anymore. Looks to me like you finally found the hard road that was actually meant for you all along." Martha didn't have an answer for that beyond the tears that came up sudden and unbidden, and Ruth held her for a long moment in the cold spring sunshine. 2 sisters who'd grown up watching the world overlook the plainer of them, finally standing together in a yard full of people who'd come specifically because they hadn't been able to overlook her after all. Bulk. The years that followed weren't easy, exactly. Martha would have been the first to say so if anyone had asked her to romanticize it, because she'd never had much patience for stories that pretended hardship simply stopped once the right people found each other. There were still bad seasons on the ranch, years the cattle prices fell low enough to worry Silas sleepless through whole winters. There were still nights Caroline woke from nightmares about losing the people she loved, old grief that never entirely disappeared so much as it learned to sit quieter in the corners of her. There were still arguments between Martha and Silas, sharp ones sometimes, about money or about the children or about Silas's stubborn habit of working himself half to exhaustion before he'd admit he needed help. Old patterns that didn't unlearn themselves overnight just because a wedding had happened. But the difference, the thing that made all of it survivable in a way the years before Martha's arrival hadn't been, was that none of them carried any of it alone anymore. Jacob grew into the kind of young man his father had needed beside him during the blizzard, steady and capable. And by the time he turned 18, he'd saved enough from ranch work, with Martha quietly adding what she could from the small remainder of her aunt's inheritance, to head east for 2 years of schooling, the first Granger to do such a thing, returning with ideas about crop rotation and cattle breeding that would end up doubling the ranch's profits within a decade. He wrote home every month without fail, long letters that always ended the same way, thanking Martha for teaching him all those years before that asking for help wasn't the same thing as failing at something alone. Mary married a young rancher from 2 valleys over when she was 20, a quiet, steady man who clearly adored her, and Martha cried harder at that wedding than she had at her own. Watching a girl who'd once peeled potatoes at midnight with the weary competence of a woman 3 times her age finally get to be young and in love and unburdened, the way she should have been allowed all along. Caroline found her voice again fully, in time, and turned out to have her mother's gift for storytelling, the narrating everything habit Mary had once described with such fondness. She taught at the Larkspur schoolhouse for years, patient with the quiet children in a way nobody had to teach her, because she remembered, better than anyone, what it felt like to need someone willing to wait. The twins stayed wild a while longer than anyone expected, but they stayed together, the way twins do, eventually taking over the day-to-day running of the ranch from their father as he aged, still finishing each other's sentences, still spinning that same battered wooden top for their own children decades later, counting the spin slow and careful, exactly as fast as it spun, no faster, no slower. A small inherited promise neither of them had ever forgotten where it came from. And Sarah, who had grabbed Martha's hand on the very first afternoon and asked her, plain and devastating, not to leave, grew up the most unguarded of all of them, the one least scarred by the years before Martha's arrival because she'd been youngest when the worst of it happened, and she would tell people for the rest of her life, with the easy confidence of a woman who'd never once doubted she was loved completely, that she remembered the exact moment she got a mother, even though she'd been too small at the time to understand what the word would come to mean. Ellie, of course, remembered none of it. She'd been a baby during the worst of the grief, an infant during the blizzard, and grew up simply knowing Martha as her mother in every sense that mattered, with no memory at all of the woman who'd given birth to her. Only the stories the others told, lovingly, of a mother she'd lost too young to know, and a mother who'd stayed to make sure that loss didn't define her. Silas never stopped being the kind of man who needed reminding, every so often, that he was allowed to rest, that the weight of the ranch and the family didn't have to sit on his shoulders alone simply because he'd once believed, in the worst months of his grief, that asking for help made him less of a father. But he learned. Slowly, imperfectly, the way real change always happens, he learned to say when he was struggling instead of disappearing into the barn to carry it silently, learned to let his children see him grieve sometimes, on the anniversary of his first wife's passing, without believing that grief made him weak in front of them. Martha never asked him to stop loving her. She only ever asked him to let the love sit honestly beside whatever new thing they were building together, and in time, that honesty became its own quiet kind of peace between them. "There's a particular lesson in all of it," Martha used to say, much later, to her own grandchildren gathered around her on the porch of a house that had long since stopped sagging or leaning anywhere. The lesson being that families aren't always made the way the storybooks promise, all neat and chosen from the start. Sometimes they're built out of a lie that needed telling because the truth felt too frightening to say plainly. Sometimes they're built by people too broken to do it alone, who get lucky enough to find someone stubborn enough to stay anyway. The blood doesn't always come first. Sometimes the choosing comes first, made over and over, in small and glamorous ways. A wooden top spun slow and counted honest, a basket of mending carried up the stairs without demanding conversation, a hand held steady through a fevered night. And the blood, in whatever sense it ends up mattering, comes later, earned rather than given. She never did go to Philadelphia. She visited once, years later, with Silas beside her, walked through the house her aunt had left her, and found it handsome and well-kept and entirely, completely empty, in a way that confirmed everything she'd already decided in that cold barn doorway all those years before. She sold it, eventually, and put the money into a proper schoolhouse for Larkspur, the kind with real books and a real teacher's salary, because she'd never forgotten what it cost a town to let its children go without. And she'd built her whole second life out of refusing to let that happen to anyone in her reach if she could help it. The Granger Ranch became, in time, one of the most respected spreads in that part of Wyoming. Not because of any particular fortune or luck, but because everyone in that county had watched, over the years, what a family built on patient, deliberate choosing could become when it was given enough seasons to grow. Edith Calloway, of all people, ended up sending her own granddaughter to Caroline's schoolhouse decades later, and never once apologized for the things she'd said in that mercantile so many years before, but she didn't have to. Martha had stopped needing that particular apology a long time before it would have arrived, somewhere around the night she set a stranger's, her husband's, broken arm by lamplight, and understood with absolute clarity exactly what kind of woman she'd turned out to be. She'd come to Wyoming believing herself unwanted, overlooked, the kind of woman men hired and didn't marry. She left that belief behind somewhere in the dirt outside a leaning barn, spinning a wooden top with two grieving boys who needed someone patient enough to count slow. She'd thought for 29 years that her worth was something other people got to decide, weighed against a face that wasn't going to charm anybody into overlooking it. It took a ruined ranch house and 5 broken-hearted children and one proud, grieving, deeply flawed man to teach her otherwise. That worth was never about being chosen first. It was about being the one who stayed when staying cost something, who kept a promise as small as counting a spinning top honestly, who held a hand through a fevered night without once letting it shake. Every conflict in that house found its resolution, in time, the way real conflicts do. Slowly, imperfectly, through ordinary days stacked one on top of another rather than any single miraculous turn. Every relationship that had been broken by grief found its way, eventually, back towards something whole, though never the same shape it had been before, because nothing broken ever heals back to its original form. It heals into something different, something that carries the memory of the break inside it, stronger in places for having been mended at all. And the family that had nearly come apart in a house with a sagging porch step, and a missing coop, and a baby who cried herself sick every night, that family found each other completely, in the end, not because fate had arranged it, but because one woman walked through a door she had every right to walk back out of, and chose again and again, in 100 small, unremarkable moments nobody else was watching, to stay.